There is no evidence for a God. Zero. But I was still preaching, and one woman came up to me after a sermon and she said, "Reverend Barker, I want you to know, I really felt the Spirit of God on your ministry." And I'm thinking, you did? I was the guy on campus. I was the guy that was going up to people and knocking on doors and preaching and playing the piano and singing, and I was so excited and I was so positive, and I would pray and I would see answers to prayer, and I would see miracles, and I would get goosebumps when I was talking to Jesus and all that. And in fact, I can still do that right now as an atheist. I won't do it here, but I can. I'm one of those people, and everybody's different. In this room, there's probably a distribution of types. Some of you might be over here on this tail end of the bell curve like me, very susceptible to mystical experiences. Well, I was, and I am still. I can go back somewhere quiet and speak in tongues, and all those feelings come back. Whoa, and I can feel this kind of parent figure, a peace that passes understanding, and I get goosebumps, and it's a pretty amazing thing. I have atheist friends who think that religious people are just faking it. Well, they're not. Well, some of them. Most of the evidence against Christianity is within Christianity. It's Christian scholars. So I was a fundamentalist for a while, but I started to read more and I started to soften, and my sermons started having less hell and more love, if you know what I mean. I started thinking less about the afterlife and the second coming and more about how do we live this life. And I thought, oh, I'm maturing, I'm becoming more sophisticated as a minister. I'm now able to see more of the gray areas. And so I became more of a moderate Christian for a while. And after a couple more years, I became also more of a liberal Christian, where I was wondering, well, maybe this whole God concept is just like, there's the parable of the prodigal son Jesus told isn't a true story. It was a parable to illustrate a truth. And the Jews made this metaphor parable about Adam and Eve, which they didn't mean it to be a true story. And I realized there are Christians, and I was meeting a lot of these pastors in my evangelism. They didn't think Adam and Eve was a literal story. They thought it was a metaphor. And then I thought, well, what other character in the Bible? Maybe Yahweh, maybe God himself is just one big parable that the Israelites made up to explain the world. I remember preaching sometimes thinking, I don't know if I believe this anymore. I stood in the pulpit and I was saying these things, and the audience was clapping and saying amen and praise God. And I remember in the summer of 1983, I realized it's just me. It's just a natural world. This is just a human invention. But I was still preaching, and one woman came up to me after a sermon and she said, "Reverend Barker, I want you to know, I really felt the Spirit of God on your ministry." And I'm thinking, you did? Because I was no longer feeling that anymore, but I was trapped in this.
Well, it must have been a terrible feeling.
It was, and it lasted until December of that year. There is no evidence for a God. Zero. In fact, Dinesh agrees with me. During our debate in Harvard last year, Dinesh said, "I am an agnostic too." We don't know if there's a God, Dinesh said. I admit it. Dinesh is kind of like another Catholic, Blaise Pascal, the mathematician philosopher, who said the same thing. He was an agnostic. He said, we can't know, we don't know, but you're better off believing. And so Dinesh says he thinks, because most people on the planet are believers, he says, what's wrong with belief? Pascal and Dinesh are what you might call theistic agnostics, and that's a very honest position, by the way. I admire that and respect that, because he's not pretending more than he can support.
Why did you become an atheist, and why should others lose their faith?
Well, because Christianity and theism don't make sense. They appeal to fear and to emotion. And I realized painfully that I was wrong. Like I told Oprah on that show, I was wrong. There's no evidence for a God, no good evidence for a God. There's no good argument for a God. And there's about a dozen arguments, design and first cause and ontological, but they're all bad. Bertrand Russell even said they just boil down to bad grammar when you look at them. There's no agreement among believers about the nature of this God or its moral principles. There is no coherent definition of a God. No one can even define what a God or what a spirit even is. There's no good reply to the problem of evil. The so-called holy books like the Bible and the Quran are really just bad moral guides. They are not reliable, they are contradictory. The Bible especially is very contradictory. The Christian God does not exist. And why are we debating just the Christian God tonight? Why not debate the existence of the God of the American Indian tribe to which I belong, the Lenape God, who banished the evil snake under the Monetta River in what is now Manhattan Island? Such a debate would be silly, wouldn't it? Because it's culture. But if God exists, why are we debating at all? Why does God need arguments? Why does he need proofs? Why not reveal himself or herself to me directly? Is he too weak to speak for himself? He needs somebody like Trent to explain it to us? This very debate is one evidence against the existence of a God. Well, besides no evidence and no argument, there's no need for a God because you can be a good, happy, moral, productive, meaningful person without believing in a God. And most of us non-believers say that holy books are horrible for morality. All you need to do is look at harm. Like your mother used to say, is it reasonable and is it kind? And if you're living a life with the intention of minimizing real harm in the real world, not trying to flatter the ego of some supernatural dictator, then that's what morality means. I am what you would call an atheistic agnostic. Atheism is simply the absence of theism. I'm also an atheist because there's no good argument for a God. Bertrand Russell looked at all the arguments, especially the ontological argument and the teleological and the cosmological and all that, and we do debates about these things all the time. And Bertrand Russell basically concluded, you know, these are all boiled down to bad grammar is all it is. None of those arguments work. Atheism is the lack of a belief in a God or gods. It's not a religion. If all the religions of the world were like a TV list of channels of all the religions, atheism would not be on that list. Atheism would be the off button. It's the none of the above. There's an old joke that if atheism is a religion, then baldness is a hair color. Or as Bill Maher said it, celibacy is a sex position. We atheists don't have the burden of proof. The one who makes the claim has the burden of proof. Atheism is a lack of belief. I'm an atheist because, first, there's a lack of even a coherent definition of God. Most believers say God is spirit, but that word spirit has never been positively defined. If you can't define it, you may as well say God is a flisterdoodle or something. Many definitions of God contain mutually exclusive characteristics, such as omniscience versus omnipotence, or omnipotence versus omnibenevolence, or free will versus omniscience. I discussed the free will argument for the non-existence of God, Fang, in my book, Free Will Explained. If you know the future, you cannot have free will. Arguing for a contradictory God is like arguing for a married bachelor. If you can't define it, then it can't exist. I'm also an atheist because there's no coherent definition of a God. How can you debate if something exists if you can't even define what it is? There is no agreement among believers as to the nature of this God or the moral principles of this God. Every one of them can open the Bible and show you, oh, here's what we believe. This church here believes that Jesus was the eternal Son of God. And that, did you know that John Calvin, a Protestant reformer, had one of his close friends, Michael Servetus, burned at the stake, a co-reformer, because Michael Servetus said, no, Jesus is not the eternal Son of God. Jesus is the Son of the eternal God. He was killed for that. Then there's a lack of good evidence for a God. If there were really good evidence, by now somebody should have won the Nobel Prize for pointing out the existence of some hitherto unknown force in the cosmos. And after 130 public debates, by now I would have seen something that counts as evidence for a God. There's also a lack of good argument. Bertrand Russell said most of these theological arguments, teleological, cosmological, ontological, and so on, simply boil down to bad grammar. They are bad logic. They beg the question. And during rebuttal, I'll show how Trent has begged the question. When the ancients heard the thunder and they saw the lightning, the only way they could explain it was by invoking Thor or Zeus. But now that we know something about electricity and the weather, we don't need those gods to fill those gaps. Those gaps closed, those gods died. There are still gaps, and that's what drives science, but to throw up our hands and say, Thor did it, or God did it, well, that's just laziness. Then there's a lack of agreement among believers about the nature and the moral principles of God. Paul said, "Let there be no division among you." Yet the religions of the world, especially Christianity, are hopelessly fractured into divisive camps. Sunnis and Shias, Protestants and Catholics, they're killing each other over these trivial, irrelevant doctrinal differences. Paul also said God is not the author of confusion. But can you think of a single book that's caused more confusion than the Bible? You believers should first get your act together before you come talk to us non-believers. Name any moral issue society is struggling with right now. You will find good, Bible-believing, church-going Christians on both sides of those controversies. The Bible is worthless as a moral guide. It's a pick and choose. Then there's the lack of a good reply to the problem of evil. All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital and you know that a good God does not exist. Those parents are praying desperately. Their children die at a rate no different from random, uncaring chance. Nothing fails like prayer, and we all know that. Most important, there's no need for a God. Hundreds of millions of good people lead loving, joyful, moral, charitable, purposeful, and hopeful lives without believing in a God.